Sometimes real evil doesn't bother hiding in the dark. Sometimes it sleeps just a few doors down, wearing a gold ring and pretending to be the man of the house. And if you're someone who believes no kid should have to suffer behind closed doors, hit that like button, subscribe, and help keep stories like this alive. Because what happened inside that little frozen house on Sycamore Lane, well, it deserves to be remembered. It all started on one of those January nights where the cold doesn't just sting your skin, it seeps straight into your bones and settles there. The snow outside had turned into a sheet of ice hours before midnight, and every cracked window in that beat-up house was dripping with condensation while the walls groaned under the weight of the wind. From the street, the place looked ordinary enough. A porch light barely hanging on, curtains pulled shut, nothing out of place. But past those shaking walls down in the basement, 14-year-old Noah Briggs sat chained by his wrist to an old radiator that hissed like it had a life of its own. The metal was so icy it felt like fire burning into his skin, and every time he shifted, the chain scraped along the concrete floor with a lonely clink that echoed through the darkness. The air was thick with the smell of rust, mildew, and a faint hint of engine oil mixed with damp cardboard. Upstairs, his stepfather Frank lay passed out on the couch, snoring like a dying engine, the TV still playing some channel nobody cared about. Noah tried to hold back his tears. He'd learned early that crying only brought more trouble. Frank called it whining, said it made him sound weak, just like his useless real dad. But the tears still showed up, hot against skin that had already gone numb from the cold. He whispered to himself, counting the seconds between the dull ticks of a furnace that hadn't worked properly in months. He'd been locked down there since before the sun dipped behind the trees. His only company was a single bulb swinging overhead, flickering every so often like even it was too tired to keep going. The chain biting at his wrist wasn't tight enough to cut him open, but it was tight enough to remind him exactly who controlled that house. His mom, Carla, used to tell him Frank could be a good man when he wanted to be. She'd always say it softly, like she was begging herself to believe it. And honestly, Frank had been kind in the beginning, back when he fixed the old car, brought Carla flowers, and called Noah Buddy. But that kindness dried up fast once the bottle became glued to his hand and his words turned into sharp little blades. Somewhere along the line, Buddy turned into boy and eventually into nothing at all. Carla used to step between them, whispering, "Frank, that's enough." But every time she tried, his rage found her instead. Tonight, she didn't fight back. She just stood there, shaking, while he yanked Noah down the stairs by the wrist, the boy's socks sliding helplessly on each wooden step. Down in the basement, every breath Noah took came out as a thin white cloud. His mind drifted to summer, the days he'd bike to the old quarry with his friends before Frank entered their lives. He thought about the frogs, the crickets, the way the nights back then still felt alive. Now, even silence felt cruel. Somewhere above him, the front door rattled in its frame. The storm outside had started to howl. Cedar Hollow was just a small town tucked between pine trees and forgotten back roads. The kind of place where folks knew everyone's business and ignored the parts that were too ugly to face. Then he heard it, a soft, hesitant creak from the floor above. The kind of sound that froze the breath in his chest. Those footsteps weren't Frank's. They were lighter, slower. "Mom?" he whispered, voice cracking. No one answered, just another creak. Then the soft click of the basement door unlocking. A thin slice of light cut down the stairs, tearing through the dark like a blade. Carla's voice trembled down to him. "Baby, you still awake?" Noah tried to answer, but his throat felt raw. "Yeah," he croaked. She came down 2 steps, wrapped in her thin robe, her face pale and eyes ringed with red. Her hand shook as she held a small flashlight. When she pointed it at the chain, her breath hitched. "Oh, God," she whispered, crouching beside him and touching his cheek. "I'm so sorry. I promise I'll get you out." But her voice wavered, the voice of a woman who had been making broken promises for a long time. She tugged at the padlock, her fingers trembling, but it wouldn't budge. Frank had the only key. "It's okay, Mom," Noah whispered, trying to force a smile. "I'm okay." But he wasn't. His lips were blue, his fingers stiff and shaking. Carla pressed her forehead to his and breathed, "Hold on, baby, just a little longer." When she went back upstairs, Noah heard her voice low and desperate on the phone. "Please, Hawk, he's hurting my boy again. I don't know what to do." There was silence. Then a deep, gravelly voice asked, "Where are you?" She told him. "Don't call the cops," the man said. "We'll handle it." Noah didn't know who this Hawk guy was. All he knew was that his mother suddenly sounded like someone who believed hope might finally be on the other end of the line. Upstairs, Frank stirred. He muttered something angry and slurred. Then the TV clicked off. The house sank into one of those heavy silences that presses down on your ribs. Noah stared at the small window near the ceiling. Outside, the snow glowed faintly beneath the moon. He shut his eyes and pictured warmth, freedom, his mom smiling like she used to. Anything but this cold. Time crawled. Maybe an hour passed, maybe 2. Then, somewhere deep in the walls, he heard a low, rhythmic vibration. At first, he thought it was the wind, until it grew louder. Steadier, more deliberate, engines, dozens of them. The sound rolled down the frozen street like thunder coming for war. Tires ground into the snow above me, that slow crunch that told you heavy machines were stopping outside. I heard voices next, short commands tossed over the rumble of engines. And for the first time that entire night, something tiny flickered inside my chest. Something that almost felt like hope trying to wake up. Upstairs, Frank exploded into a shout. A sharp curse, followed by the heavy thud of his boots hammering across the floor. "Who the hell's out there?" he roared. I flinched as his footsteps stormed toward the front door. The basement light flickered hard, stretching long shadows across the walls like they were trying to crawl away from the noise. Then came the slam of the door. The engines cut off all at once, and the silence that followed felt heavier than the storm outside. I held my breath. Through the cracks in the ceiling boards, I heard that deep voice again, the one my mom had called earlier, calm, steady, dangerous, without raising a single decibel. "Frank Briggs," the man said, "we need to talk." Frank's reply came out muffled but soaked in fury. "Who the hell are you?" I strained to hear, my heart thumping so hard it almost drowned out the sound of boots, dozens of them, marching across the floor. "I'm the man who just got a call about a boy in chains," the voice answered. Then chaos hit. A crash shook the whole house. Wood splintered. Something, maybe the TV, slammed onto the floor. Frank screamed something that ended in a grunt of pain. The walls trembled. My chain rattled against the radiator as I jerked upright. A second later, the basement door exploded open. Light slashed through the darkness. And for a heartbeat, I thought my mom had come back. But the figure on the stairs wasn't her. A man with a shaved head stepped into view, wearing a heavy leather jacket marked with a silver skull and wings. Behind him, more men crowded the steps, their boots thundering like a verdict. He looked from me to the chain holding my wrist. His jaw clenched. "Hang on, kid," he said, pulling bolt cutters from his belt. "We're breaking every chain tonight." The lock snapped with a single bite of the cutters. The chain fell away from my wrist, clattering onto the concrete. I exhaled like I'd been holding my breath for years. He draped his jacket over my shoulders. Thick, warm, smelling like leather, smoke, and something that somehow meant safety. "You're all right now," he told me. "We've got you." And standing there in that freezing basement surrounded by strangers who smelled like steel and freedom, I realized something I'd never forgotten since. Heroes don't always carry badges. Sometimes they ride in on two wheels and refuse to let anyone suffer alone. The ringing echo of that broken chain followed me as Hawk, because that was the shaved head man's name, lifted me into his arms and carried me up the stairs. The cold basement air spilled out around us like it was trying to chase us, but his jacket wrapped around me held it at bay. The storm outside had thickened into a white curtain. The wind howled like some wounded animal, but the men filling our living room didn't move an inch. Dozens of bikers, each wearing the patch of the Iron Saints Motorcycle Club, stood steady and focused, moving like a trained rescue crew. Frank lay slumped near the fallen couch, half conscious, a thin streak of blood running from his forehead where he'd clearly hit something hard. Two bikers towered over him, arms crossed, shadows stretching tall across the walls. I blinked against the sudden brightness of the living room. Near the fireplace, my mom sat on the floor, clutching a blanket like it was the only thing keeping her upright. When she saw Hawk carrying me, she let out a sound I'd never heard from her before, half sob, half prayer. "Oh, thank God," she breathed, pulling me into her arms the moment Hawk set me down. Her fingers brushed the raw mark on my wrist. "I'm so sorry, baby. I should have protected you sooner." I pressed my face into her shoulder, the warmth of her skin hitting me like sunlight after weeks of darkness. I wanted to tell her I understood, that it wasn't her fault, but the words stayed stuck in my throat. Hawk crouched beside us, his voice steady and low. "You did the right thing tonight, Carla. Making that call took guts." She shook her head, terrified. "He's going to kill us for this." Hawk's expression darkened. "No, ma'am, he isn't." Behind him, a big guy with a scar down his jaw spoke up. "Sheriff's on his way." "The real sheriff," he added, eyeing Frank, who was now trying to sit up, confused and angry. "We already gave him the story." Frank spat blood and tried to rise. "You can't just bust into my house." Hawk stood to his full height, calm but somehow louder than any shouting. "We didn't bust in, Frank," he said quietly. "We broke through. For the kid you were supposed to protect." For a moment, Frank looked like he might attack again, but something in him drained when his eyes locked with Hawk's. Maybe it was the wall of bikers filling the doorway shoulder to shoulder. Or maybe it was the steady, unblinking certainty in Hawk's stare, the look of a man who'd seen monsters before and dealt with them. Frank's gaze dropped. He muttered curses under his breath. Outside, the storm began to ease. Engines idled in the driveway, steady and patient. From the window, I could see faint headlights cutting through the snow like distant stars guiding the night. There were at least 20 bikes out there, maybe more, their chrome catching the porch light and shining like some kind of promise. I couldn't understand why all these men had come for someone like me, a kid none of them had ever met. But something about the way they stood there, calm and solid, made the fear inside me start to melt away. One of them, a younger guy with tattoos crawling over his hands, knelt down beside me. "Name's Cutter," he said with a half smirk. "We don't usually make house calls, but Hawk said this one was family business." "Family?" I frowned, confused. Cutter nodded. Yeah, your uncle rode with us, Mike Riley, best mechanic the club ever had. The name hit me like a spark in the dark. I remembered it, just barely, a photo in a shoebox, a man smiling with grease on his shirt. My mom crying over it once when she thought I wasn't looking. Uncle Mike, I whispered. Carla looked up, tears already forming. He died before you were born, she said softly, but he rode with them. Hawk gave a slow, respectful nod. He was one of ours, and we don't forget our own. While we talked, two bikers helped Carla to her feet, guiding her toward the fireplace. They wrapped a thick blanket around her shoulders and eased her into a chair. The whole room smelled like wet leather, spilled oil, pine from the shattered door. But somehow, in the middle of all that chaos, the house felt safer than it ever had before. Hawk turned back to me. We've got a doctor waiting at the clubhouse, he said. Just want to make sure you're all right. You're coming with us tonight. Carla's face flashed with panic. You can't take him. What if people say I let strangers run off with my son? Hawk's voice softened. Carla, those men out there aren't strangers. They're the reason your boy's still breathing. And we're not taking him away, we're taking him home. A knock at the door cut through the tension. The sheriff stepped inside, boots dusted with snow, his hand resting on his holster, but not out of suspicion, more like habit. His expression carried something surprising, respect. Evenin', Hawk, he said. Heard there was trouble. Hawk gestured toward Frank, who was still slumped by the couch. One of the bikers, Goose, snorted. Guy chained his stepson to a radiator, Hawk said flatly. That about sums it up. The sheriff let out a tired sigh. Yeah, that does it. He walked over to Frank, pulling handcuffs from his belt. Frank Briggs, you're under arrest for child abuse and unlawful restraint. Frank tried to spit out excuses, but whatever words he had died the second those cuffs snapped shut. As the sheriff dragged him toward the door, Frank shot me a look, cold and hateful. You think this is over, boy? He growled. Before I could even breathe, Hawk stepped in front of me, blocking Frank's stare. It's over, Hawk said quietly, and you won't ever touch him again. When the patrol car pulled away, the tension drained from the room. The bikers started filing out one by one, until only Hawk, Cutter, and my mom, still shaking by the fire, remained. Hawk leaned back against the wall, exhaling slowly. You got somewhere safe to go? Carla hesitated. My sister lives in Maple Creek, about an hour from here. Hawk nodded. Good. You and the boy head there tomorrow, but tonight you ride with us. He's not spending another night in this house. I didn't argue. I couldn't. The thought of going back into that basement made my stomach twist. Hawk held out his gloved hand. I took it without hesitation. The leather was worn and warm, his grip steady and careful. Together, we stepped outside. The night felt alive. Engines idled low, headlights glowing through the snowfall like fireflies drifting in the dark. The men stood ready in two perfect rows, their bikes gleaming under the moon. Someone handed me a helmet, black with silver stripes, and a single word etched on the side, freedom. Hawk lifted me onto the back of his bike, then swung himself into the front seat. You ever ridden before? He asked over his shoulder. I shook my head. First time for everything, Hawk said with a crooked grin, turning the key. The engine rumbled to life beneath us. Deep, steady, powerful, but not scary. It felt like the heartbeat of something big, something alive. The other bikes roared awake, echoing through Cedar Hollow until the whole valley trembled under the sound. Neighbors peeked through curtains, some recording with their phones. but no one dared step outside. They didn't need to. The scene said everything. The boy, who'd been chained in the dark, was riding out surrounded by an army, men who refused to let him fall ever again. Snow stung my cheeks as we took off, cold but clean, washing away what was left of the basement. I clung tight to Hawk's jacket, pressing my face into the rough leather patch stitched with the Iron Saints emblem. Ahead of us, the road cut through the snow in a long, open stretch of white. For the first time in my life, it didn't feel lonely. It felt like possibility. Behind us, the old house on Sycamore Lane disappeared into the dark. Its broken door swung in the wind like a ghost waving goodbye. And as the riders thundered toward the horizon, I looked back once, just long enough to see the severed chain lying in the snow, catching a sliver of moonlight. A final reminder of everything I was leaving behind. That broken chain lying in the snow felt like more than scrap metal. It was the last piece of fear I'd carried inside me, shattered, scattered, and left behind for good. It wasn't just a lock or a prison. It was a symbol of everything those men destroyed that night. By the time dawn crept over the hills, the long line of motorcycles had taken me farther from Sycamore Lane than I'd ever been in my whole life. The storm had softened into a light drizzle that shimmered across the highway, and the gray morning light stretched out over fields still sleeping under winter's touch. Hawk rode at the front, his taillight glowing through the fog like a tiny red star guiding the way. For the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't scared. I held on to Hawk's jacket, feeling the steady hum of the bike and the rhythm of the road beneath us. The engines behind us weren't roaring in anger. They beat together like a shared heartbeat, a sound that felt like freedom more than anything else. When we finally reached the Iron Saints clubhouse, it didn't look anything like the rumors I'd overheard back in town. It wasn't some smoky, wild biker bar. It was actually a converted fire station, warm light pouring through the windows, flags fluttering above the entrance like someone cared about the place. Inside, the air smelled of strong coffee, leather jackets, and motor oil. Soft chatter rolled through the room, calm and steady, nothing dangerous or chaotic. A tall woman in a denim vest, Doc Casey, the others called her, knelt beside me the moment I climbed off the bike. Her touch was firm but gentle as she checked my pulse, my wrists, the angry red marks where the chain had bitten into my skin. "He's dehydrated," she said quietly, "but he'll pull through. He just needs heat and rest." Hawk nodded, a flash of relief crossing his usually stoic face. "Then, that's exactly what he'll get." Carla arrived a little later, escorted by two of the riders who'd driven behind us in a pickup. She looked different somehow, less broken, more like someone who'd finally remembered she had strength. When she spotted me on the couch, wrapped in a blanket with a cup of hot cocoa warming my hands, she exhaled so sharply it sounded like a gasp of pure relief. She knelt beside me, brushing my damp hair away from my forehead. "You're safe now," she whispered. I nodded, but she could still see the distance in my eyes. I'd learned not to trust promises. Not right away, Hawk noticed. He crouched next to us, placing a big, steady hand on my shoulder. "You don't have to trust us yet, kid," he murmured. "Just trust the road in front of you. The rest will come." Outside, the Iron Saints moved with quiet purpose. No yelling, no chaos. They made calls, spoke with social services, contacted every connection they trusted. They'd watched too many kids slip through cracks, and they weren't about to let Frank Briggs become another loophole. By noon, the news came in. Frank's bail had been denied. The sheriff called Hawk personally. "That boy won't see him again," the sheriff said. Hawk's answer was a simple, quiet, "good." The days that followed were slow. but each one felt like a sunrise for me. I slept without nightmares for the first time in years. The kind of sleep where you hit the pillow and don't wake up shaking. I learned the riders' names: Cutter, Bear, Doc, Wrench, Tank. Every one of them carried their own story, written in old scars and patched leather. They showed me how to clean chrome, how to check oil, how to trust my own hands again. Carla helped in the kitchen, laughing whenever Tank ruined breakfast for the third time in a row. The clubhouse wasn't a place to fear. It was a home built by people society had once thrown away, and somehow they'd found space for one more. A week later, after the storm had long cleared, the Iron Saints gathered in the open lot behind the clubhouse. The winter sun hung low in the sky, scattering cold light across rows of gleaming motorcycles. Hawk stood at the front, a familiar chain coiled in his hands, the same chain that had once held me to that radiator. It looked small now, almost harmless, but everyone's eyes were fixed on it. This, Hawk said, raising it, was a weapon in the wrong hands. But tonight it's a reminder of what we break and why we ride. He tossed the chain into a burn barrel. The flames flared bright, swallowing the metal until it glowed orange and hissed like it wanted to fight its own ending. The riders stood in absolute silence as the fire consumed it. I stepped closer, my mom beside me. The heat from the flames brushed across our faces, warm and real. For the first time in his life, Noah felt the weight on his chest lift, like that crushing night finally loosened its grip. Hawk turned toward him, opening his hand and dropping something into Noah's palm. A small iron key, dull, cold, and heavier than it looked. "What's this?" Noah asked softly. Hawk gave him a faint smile. "That's the key that used to lock your chain. I want you to keep it. Just so you remember, you're the one who chooses what stays locked in your life and what gets freed." Noah stared at the little piece of metal for a long moment before nodding. "Thank you," he whispered. Hawk shook his head. "Don't thank me, kid. Thank your mom. She made the call." Carla's eyes filled with tears as she squeezed Noah's hand, her thumb brushing over the back of it like she was afraid to let go. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills and painted the sky in soft gold, the Iron Saints prepared for one final ride, a victory lap through Cedar Hollow. Noah stood beside Hawk's Harley, the same black and chrome machine that had carried him out of that frozen basement and into a new world. Hawk handed him a smaller helmet this time, polished until it gleamed, a silver wing decal shining under the porch light. "You ready?" Hawk asked. Noah grinned. An honest, wide grin Hawk had never seen from him before. "Yeah, let's ride." When the engines roared to life, the sound rolled over the town like thunder sliding across calm water. People came out onto their porches, drawn by the noise, watching as rows of bikers rumbled down the street. Leather flashed, headlights blazed, boots pressed into highway steel. In the center of it all, Hawk rode with Noah holding tight around his waist, his laughter carried away by the wind. They passed the diner, the hardware store, and eventually the house on Sycamore Lane. The broken door had been replaced. The windows were sealed up. But it wasn't home anymore. It was just a building now, empty, powerless, no more threatening than a shed in a field. Noah didn't even turn his head to look at it. They kept riding until the sun bled out into the horizon, streaks of crimson fading into blue. By the time they circled back to the clubhouse, the stars had already scattered across the sky. Hawk parked his bike, the others pulling in behind him, engines shutting off one after another until the whole night belonged only to the wind and a few distant crickets. Noah slid off the bike and lifted off his helmet. The world felt big again, huge, open, and finally his. He glanced up at the stars, then at a hawk. "So, what happens now?" he asked. Hawk smiled, a spark in his eye. "Now you live, kid, you breathe, you ride when you're ready, and you never, ever let anyone chain you down again." Weeks later, when spring started painting Cedar Hollow in fresh greens, Carla and Noah moved into a small cabin just outside town. It wasn't fancy, but it was theirs, and it was safe. The Iron Saints visited often, sometimes to fix something broken, sometimes just to share food and laughter. Slowly, even the town started to shift. People talked more, cared more, paid attention to things they used to ignore. Maybe it was the memory of that roaring night, or maybe it was something bigger, proof that hope can come from places nobody expects. On the mantel inside their new home sat two things: the old iron key and a photograph Hawk had given them. In the picture, Noah stood between the riders, smiling wide. At the bottom, the words read, "Iron Saints Brotherhood Ride, 2225. Under it, in Carla's neat handwriting, she'd added a single line. "Sometimes the chains that hold us aren't made of steel, but every single one of them can be broken." And every time Noah looked at that photo, he remembered the night the engines came thundering through the snow, not just to save him, but to remind the world that even in the darkest cold, there are people willing to ride straight into the storm to bring the light back.